Good evening. I am Anand Khatri, a professor at the APJ School of Architecture, and I'm very happy to be here with you all for this session today. Today, we will be talking about the Taliesin experience. Taliesin, a school of Frank Lloyd Wright. And the speaker for the day is Professor Vivek Sabherwal, who is the director for APJ School of Architecture. He was the first Indian to be gaining a degree in Masters of Architecture from the Taliesin School, which was started by Frank Lloyd Wright. I welcome Professor Vivek.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Anand. I think before we start, I just wanted to welcome all the architect friends and students who will largely form the participants. Let me at the onset tell you why we have chosen today to pay a tribute to Frank Lloyd Wright. You know, the reason for picking today as the day is we are celebrating his birth anniversary, which is on June 8th. And see, Mr. Wright always saw architecture as a way of life. And to him, it was not enough to just be good architects in the conventional sense, but also to be good, responsible human beings, a view which is also shared by our Shastras. And in the presentation today, the objective is multifold. One is to understand and explore the principles of organic architecture as espoused by Frank Lloyd Wright. Then to share the total learning experience I had at Taliesin during my tenure from 1992 through 1995. And third is to make the architects and students understand the the vast spectrum of Mr. Wright's creative work, which goes beyond just the design of buildings, because he was concerned about architecture in totality. And there are many nuggets of wisdom that I'll be sharing through this presentation, which will make people understand what Mr. Wright was all about. So, and it would allow us to peer into in his heart and his mind. And so before we start the presentation, I would just like to inform all the participants here that this presentation is through a film where we will explore, first we'll try and understand who was Mr. Wright, and then have a glimpse of some of his works, and then we'll get on to the Taliesin experience. So I would hand it over to my moderator, Anand Khatri, to start the session. Frank Lloyd Wright was born in 1867 in Richmond Center, Wisconsin, USA. And he designed over 700 buildings, and his working life spanned more than 60 years. Frank Lloyd Wright planned and designed great landmarks such as Fallingwater House, Roby House, Johnson Wax Building, Usonian Houses, the Guggenheim Museum, the Imperial Hotel, Marin County Civic Center, Broadacre City, Rogers Lacey Hotel, and Taliesin East and Taliesin West, and many other buildings until his death in 1959. When we look back on the tremendous amount of work, both built and unbuilt, that followed up until his death, we witness a remarkable panorama of forms, ideas, concepts, and applications of architecture in the service of humanity. What we are left with was his legacy. Beyond what he created as an architect is what he promulgated as a man of ideas. Paramount among those ideas is this very strong concept that the architect, to put in his own words, must be the most comprehensive of all the masters, the most comprehensive of all the human beings on earth. Frank Lloyd Wright was a man in the right place at the right time. His parents were teachers. His aunts ran a progressive school, and his uncle was a famous minister. Anna Lloyd Jones, mother of Frank Lloyd Wright, imbued in her son a love for nature as a child, which became the greatest inspirational force in his life later. Before he was born, his mother decided he would become an architect. An educator herself, she discovered that the feeble system called kindergarten gifts, by way of which a child was taught to draw using basic geometric shapes and forms. Mr. Wright in his later years regularly cited the feeble gifts as one of the most profound influences on his approach to architecture. These simple geometric toys helped Mr. Wright nurture a lifelong fascination for geometric shapes, the line and the spiral, the circle and the sphere, the square and the cube, the triangle and the tetrahedron. His father, William Carey Wright, was a preacher and a musician who taught his son to listen to music as an edifice of sound. Working on his uncle's farm at the age of 9, he received a lifelong lesson on the rhythmic cycles of nature. Here's where he first experienced the processes of nature. There's an old proverb, destiny is not a matter of chance, it's a matter of choice. It's not a thing to be waited for, it's a thing to be achieved. During his childhood, she imbued in him a love for nature, a love that became the greatest inspirational force in his life. Nature became his Bible. We spell God with a capital G, he said, and I spell nature with a capital N. He started his career in Chicago, where there were many opportunities for building following the Great Fire of 1871. His innovative ideas for structures were made possible by the availability of many new materials and construction methods: steel, sheet metal, reinforced concrete, plate glass, and plastics. At the root of Mr. Wright's genius was his amazing ability for absorption. He saw everything in life as something to be looked into, something to learn from. Although nature was his most significant teacher, he had many other influences in his life. Largely self-educated, he was an avid reader. Among his many heroes were Thomas Jefferson, Ralph Emerson, Bach, Beethoven, William Blake, Lao Tse, Leonardo da Vinci, Hiroshige, Walt Whitman, and Louis Sullivan. And who does not know who Louis Sullivan was? And Louis Sullivan had a great influence on Frank Lloyd Wright. It is said that in 1871, when he first approached Mr. Sullivan for work and he showed him his drawings, Mr. Sullivan could not believe that the drawings that Mr. Wright was showing him were his own drawings and not tracings, and he immediately got a job in his office. But Mr. Wright did not stay too long at Mr. Sullivan's office, and he opened his architecture office in Chicago in 1893. As his ideas and designs evolved, Mr. Wright began to articulate a philosophy of what he termed organic architecture. At the time he entered the profession, virtually all architects in the Western world followed traditional styles and designed according to specific formulas. The classical forms they followed were imported from Europe, but Mr. Wright believed that the country, that is America, should have an architecture of its own, and he set out to create it. As a defining force of organic architecture, he had added immeasurably to the quality of the lives, not only Americans, but all over the world. He did not ever claim to invent organic architecture. He found it manifested everywhere in nature. He found evidence of architecture true to its time and place in the ancient cultures of Persia, Byzantium, China, Japan, and pre-Columbian America. The principles and tenets that he articulated are evidence of his constant search for universal truth. Even his earliest works had about it the continence of principle, and as his work continued to evolve, one can see both ideals and ideas at work. Mr. Wright saw architecture as a great source of inspiration to mankind and was convinced that it must constantly evolve and respond to new technology. He believed that architecture would be a great contribution to the great civilization of the future. He was convinced that lifelong learning is essential. In an ideal society, the teachers he observed would be those who had achieved the highest level of human development and had accomplished something worthwhile in life. But he found most learning institutions to be theoretical and dogmatic. He did not believe that the essentials of life could be taught in a classroom. They have to be experienced. Education without enlightenment, he concluded, is merely a matter of conditioning, and he did not believe in that. Education to him was beyond, he believed in self-education. He looked for the day when art, science, and religion realized that their interest and source of inspiration are the one and the same. He believed that architecture should be a work of art that is eminently practical. It must serve the client's needs, be in harmony with its site, and respond to the climate. He also believed that no two projects are the same and that each design solution should be suited to the specific site and the client. Like Mr. Wright, architects of today need to understand that buildings can influence those who use them and should be much more than comfortable shelters, status symbols, and beautiful things. Mr. Wright believed that buildings affect the quality of people psychologically and spiritually. He had a wonderful clarity of thought. Mr. Wright believed that the purpose of architecture was to improve human life. He expected architecture to preserve the nuclear family, nurture religious and social institutions, reform the corporate workplace, and he was able to produce a new prototype for practically every building type and useful to society. Mr. Wright left behind a body of inspiring architectural work, which gives an opportunity to the architects of today to expand the sphere of architecture. More than 20 years after his death, an architectural record, a leading journal at the point of time, polled the world's leading architects and scholars to determine the 100 most significant buildings in the world in the past 100 years. 12 of those selected were by Frank Lloyd Wright. Fallingwater was at the top of the list, and 6 of his designs were placed in the top 25. In 1949, he was awarded the AIA Gold Medal, the highest honor of the American Institute of Architects. John Rattenbury, who had joined the Taliesin Fellowship in 1950 and had worked very closely with Mr. Wright on several prestigious projects, and he was a very senior architect in Taliesin Architects Limited, a firm founded during Mr. Wright's time. And I had an opportunity to work with him during my tenure at Taliesin. And he always believed that Mr. Wright had this special ability by which he could see in 3 dimensions.
Out of his 700 projects, which of his projects do you feel are the most significant?
I would describe some of Mr. Wright's significant buildings, not in any specific order. One of them was the Johnson Administration Building. In 1939, the Life magazine called S.C. Johnson and Son Administration Building the greatest innovation in business building since the advent of the skyscraper. Even today, the building remains as an architectural marvel. Mr. Wright not only rethought the modern office, he also gave the grandest, most monumental, most light-filled space to the clerical wonders and naming it the Great Workroom. While the design and construction of the administration building was a wide departure from present building practices at that point of time, it was planned specifically from a functional standpoint after Mr. Wright had studied the flow of work and other problems involved in the execution of the company business. And it was an expression of an ideal working environment, free from any hierarchy system. And the key to the creation of this interior realm was the use of the open plan for the office. And the very word open plan that we talked about today actually originated from here. And if you look at the interior and see the quality of light that came from above, Mr. Wright pushed the materials to their limits. Mr. Wright invented a column to support the roof that allowed light to pour into the interior. He was able to find the perfect metaphor for his structural system with the design of his building. The furniture was primarily metal. The furniture was conceived in circles and curves, much like the building. But what is so unique about this workroom, which measures 128 feet by 208 feet? The glass in this room is not in panes but tubing, and several layers of different sizes that are used to admit light but no view. And the columns that you see, the structure utilizes the dendriform columns designed on the structures of a flower with stem, calyx and petals, obtaining greater structural strength, beauty and greater floor space. And a striking feature of the remarkable building is the simple repetition of slender, monolithic, dendriform shafts or columns standing on metal tips bedded on the floor level. The column brought a revolution in the use of concrete in columnar construction. Prior to this, columns had invariably been at the same diameter at the base at the top or of greater diameter at the base, thus wasting valuable floor space. The columns here, what you see, has a base diameter of only 230 mm, 9 inches, and widened gradually to form a calyx of 2 feet to 10 inches in diameter at the top, then spread like an inverted umbrella top to a diameter of 18.5 feet. The tallest columns in the lobby area were 31 feet high, and those in the main building were 21 feet, 7.5 inches high. And the columns supported 6 times the weight imposed on them. In fact, Mr. Wright had to demonstrate in order to obtain building permit. And another unique building which Mr. Wright did was in Chicago, the Roby House, which was completed in 1909 and is cited as the finest example of prairie architecture. Mr. Wright called the house the cornerstone of modern architecture. It floats serenely in the Chicago landscape. The great hovering roof with its extraordinary cantilever represent the perfect statement of a prairie house. And Mr. Wright carefully planned the progression of arrival into the house, following the Zen principle of hide and reveal. Throughout the house, there is no manipulation of space, yin and yang attitudes of space and form, horizontal and vertical, light and dark, and outdoors and indoors. And on the ground floor, there are entrances and the utilities, a billiard room and a playroom. The first floor contains the living room and dining room, extending the full length of the house as one long space, only partially divided by a fireplace and an entrance stairway. And being on a busy road, the sightlines are such that the Robys could see first floor down on the street, but they themselves were not visible. The privacy was crucial to the Robys, and since the house was close to public right-of-way, street noise was directed outward and upward. The height and step-back aspects of balcony parapet had the effect of blocking the direct path of sound transmission and lessening the impact on various points of reception. One of Mr. Wright's unique projects was again Broadacre City. This was an example to Le Corbusier's plan and his own version of the English garden city. Mr. Wright's image was of individuality and the family. His urban vision sought tranquility, permanence, and roots that characterize the image of a home. Broadacre was evolved during the 30s, soon after Mr. Wright established the Taliesin Fellowship. It was of central significance to the last 30 years of Mr. Wright's architectural output, as embodied in the model as well as the drawings. Broadacre is depicted as a 4 square mile segment of America, an indefinitely expandable grid where all residential, industrial, and social amenities are represented. The Usonian house became the basic residential unit for the Broadacre. where every person could have an acre of land and enjoy the freedom and space in a decentralized human environment, combining the best of an urban and rural world. Mr. Wright at that time seemed much enamored of 1 to 5 acres for each home. It may have seemed excessive now that the model represented a 4 mile area accommodating 140 families, and the entry was by the main arterial road or inter-county highways of 10 car lanes above and 2 truck lanes and continuous warehousing below. This Mr. Wright's good architecture arose from a deep understanding. Broadacre City does not represent in any way a proposed plan, a fixed formal arrangement. This is precisely what Broadacre is not all about. Mr. Wright said, I believe that a general outline of any ideal is better than a specific plan or a model of its particular features. An ideal core clearly fixed in mind, and the plan will come naturally enough. Another of his grand innovative work was done in New York, the Guggenheim Museum. Mr. Wright's architecture goes beyond manipulation of a form. His fundamental genius was in creating space that was based on a highly ordered scheme. There can be no doubt in anyone's mind of Mr. Wright's greatness when you stand in the rotunda of the Guggenheim, where the space at once encloses you and lifts you like a rocket. Commissioned to Mr. Wright in 1942, it was designed and redesigned for several years and opened 6 months after Mr. Wright's death. It breaks every rule in architecture. It is so astonishing as a piece of architecture, and of course it makes you feel that rules hardly matter. Critics called it a monstrous concrete intrusion in the Fifth Avenue when it came about. Some even questioned its sitting not appropriate as a museum. Some leading artists argued that the building with its tilted walls, sloping floors, and relentless 3/4 mile ramp was not suitable for a sympathetic display of painting and sculpture. In fact, the directors of the museum found a difficult job trying to make objects of art appear as special and separate entities in a Wright building. Over the years, the experience of thousands of galleries proves the artist's fear was well founded. There's a lot of architecture in the world that is capable of exciting people when they walk in. This one does. Never mind if it has limitations as a gallery. The space is designed to offer many significant effects as the journey, as one enters through the elevator and finding the space large enough, and you begin the journey downward on the ramp, instantly inviting movement.
The Guggenheim indeed is a very, very mesmerizing building. We never know where the concept came from. But I believe that talking about FLW is not possible without speaking about the Fallingwater House, a project for which he got many recognitions, and something which is listed among the Smithsonian's list of 28 places to see before you die. The project has received many awards. Please throw some light on this project of FLW.
One of the most significant buildings of Mr. Wright's career was Fallingwater House. This is a house which brought Mr. Wright into public view as never before. It is recognized worldwide as a milestone both in Mr. Wright's career and in the history of American domestic architecture. Fallingwater is the antithesis of Taliesin. It was designed in 1936 for Edgar Kaufman as the weekend vacation house. And the key to the setting of the house is the waterfall over which it is built. The falls had been a focal point of the client's family activities, and that indicated the area around the falls as the location for a home. They were unprepared for Mr. Wright's suggestion that the house rise above the waterfall rather than face it. The house grows majestically from the site, gracefully. It has mystical qualities, as if it exists only in someone's dream. It is architecture of the highest order. The whole structure springs from rock outcropping, with the fireplace and its core placed so that the ledge to the north and the waterfall to the southwest became an integral part of the house. Fallingwater provides numerous examples for teaching conceptualization. I would advise every student and architect, young architect, to experience this legendary structure at least once in their lifetime. Fallingwater could not have been created without the long research and experimentation that went into Taliesin. Mr. Wright's architectural education was largely informal or contextual. Deceptively simple in appearance, this house, like any other organic structure, is extremely complex in its integration of one part to another. Conventional structural pedagogy is inappropriate to the study of this house, and an effective knowledge of fundamental architectural structure principles is a must to understand to connect conceptual learning. Mr. Wright chose a method of construction he had not used before in a residence. Mr. Wright saw the cantilever as a profoundly natural principle, as an outstretched arm, or the tree branch growing out from the trunk. Mr. Wright saw the cantilever could perform remarkable things in liberating space and creating planes parallel to the earth. He described the cantilever action being similar to the balance of a tray on a waiter's fingers. And the cantilevers at Fallingwater are daring, allowing the house to soar in all directions, practically defying the laws of gravity. The main floor of the house consists of a large living room to the south and cantilevering out over the falls, as you can see, with the dining and service to the north and west entered from northeast. In fact, the house entrance was not visible till you reached you had to actually look for it. Overall, the house is a complex composition of horizontal and vertical forms and structural elements. The horizontal forms are rendered in reinforced concrete, while the vertical forms consist of stone masses, piers and columns and walls. All horizontal elements project outward, between, through and beyond the stone verticals, giving a sense of movement and seem to spring through space and beyond. The hovering quality of the building is revealed by having the vertical support hidden in the shadows. The glass walls separate the solid elements of the composition, but also used for storage cabinets and shelves, giving a usefulness which the curtain wall in the international style never reached. Echoing the ledge below, the terraces appear thick while roof and trellis slabs are thin. They are about 4,500 square feet of enclosed area, very efficiently arranged. However, there are 3,000 square feet of exterior terracing, balconies and porch, which are so related to the interior and exterior spaces that neither can be imagined without the other. One approaches the entrance like any other Mr. Wright building, through a constricted, dark, protected porch, feeling compressed. On entering the main space, the living room, one is transformed into another world. Generally, this space is expressed vertically. However, here, since the whole composition is horizontal, the ceiling of the living room is raised only by a few inches. In the living room, the different alcoves surround the central space with enclosing space of stone and glass, offer intimate space with furniture so arranged that it accommodates sitting, study work and dining. Each space is felt individually, yet the alcoves of space are juxtaposed to release space flowing out to the terraces and beyond the gorges, down to the stairs and to the water stream. The whole is suggested in the parts and the parts suggest the whole. The furniture stands parallel in concept and form to the architecture of the house. The tops of the table and the support echo the cantilevered forms of the house itself. The interior space reveals the different moods through different lighting intensity by controlled natural light flooding the southeast western portion of the main living area. The primary structure of the floor slab is actually contained within 2 feet deep framing system that includes primary beams and secondary structural joists, and hidden between flagstone paving are a 4-inch thick slab below. The living room floor is framed by 4 main beams of cantilever beyond the bolsters beneath. Mr. Wright wanted to demonstrate that the structure is only a means to an end, not the end itself. The house provides a rich context in which to explore structural and building issues because of its singular importance in architectural history, not simply as a means for understanding structural principles, but as an example of how the understanding enhances the architectural understanding. Fallingwater is Mr. Wright's greatest essay in horizontal spaces. It is the most powerful example of the marriage between nature and architecture.
FLW had a very wide range of projects, each exhibiting a very distinct character. After hearing about Falling Waters, one gets to have a feel that it is not possible to stay away from work to create such projects. To give depth of aesthetics of this kind, you have to be on the job. FLW lived and worked from his office, which was called Taliesin, the studio. Taliesin Studio is the place where he had also started the fellowship and where apprentices had started coming in. Could you please tell us something about Taliesin East?
I'm going to talk about Taliesin East, Mr. Wright's home. Not only his home, but the home of the fellowship. Taliesin East, which is located in Spring Green, Wisconsin, was the place which Mr. Wright built from 1911 onwards, and this was the property he inherited from his parents, a wide 600 acres of land. And by now you would be wondering where this word Taliesin came from. So let me share with you that Taliesin was the name of a Welsh poet, a singer of songs who sang at Wales the glories of fine art, and in Welsh it means shining brow. So in selecting the name, Mr. Wright foreshadowed his intentions to make Taliesin a place where all the arts were treasured and pursued. And if you look at this picture, you would see that Taliesin is not located on the top of the hill, but at the brow of the hill. That's how the name Taliesin came about. Now, as I said, this was his home in Spring Green, and to me, it's one of the most architecturally significant landmarks of the 20th century. The first time when I saw it, I claimed to myself that it was more beautiful than I had imagined it to be. The glorious pictures I had seen gave no comprehension as to its immensity. I was impressed by the spaces, the way natural light created a golden glow that reflected of the oriental art with the harmonious surroundings. And if you look at this picture from a distance, it does not seem so very large, but it was a fairly large building. But the way it was, it fitted into the landscape, that it seemed that it always belonged to the place. For the first couple of days and weeks, I made it a special point to drive past, walk around and photograph Taliesin, and each time it looked different. And there seems to be no end to the sloping roofs. It was constantly enlarged, modified throughout its life. Everything from the landscape, grounds, furniture, to the lighting, furnishings, collected objects, and of course the buildings are designed by Mr. Wright, the genius. And this was the home which had housed his home, studio, workshop, and its doors were always open to visitors. who would come. The materials used here are very simple and inexpensive, and the building seems to grow from the side. The largest building in the campus here was spread over 37,000 square feet, comprising of his living quarters, drafting studio, guest rooms, farm buildings, and various other structures. The lines of the hills were the lines of the roof. The slopes of the hills, their slopes. The plastered surface of light wood walls, set back into the shade of the broad eaves, were like flat stretches of sand in the river below. In the same color, for that is where the material came from. He used sand from the nearby Wisconsin River in the mix of plaster and had limestone quarried from a location nearby. As a result, the color and texture of the materials echoed the surrounding rock cropping and riverbed. Taliesin thus became the visual, poetic metaphor of the regional landscape. And the other buildings in the campus, which included the Romeo and Juliet Windmill, which was located away from the main house, and Hillside Drafting Studio, and Midway Barns, and some cottages for staying facilities. Midway was halfway between the school and his home. And he also was able to, like in any other buildings, he liked to hide the entrance, and one had to constantly probe and explore the entrance. Now, in this picture that you would see, that you would actually look for the entrance to his living room. So you would climb these steps, you would turn in different directions, explore the place until you found its entrance. And the living room, when you entered through a narrow space, and then the place would open up to a large room. So the drama of space made it so exciting. The living room had been often referred as the greatest domestic room in America. This spacious room is a timeless example of classic contemporary design. It is beautiful and mystical. The overlapping of spaces, the angular and horizontal lines are complex and yet give a feeling of repose when you sit down. It is furnished with Mr. Wright's furniture, lighting fixtures, and other utility objects designed over a period of 30 years. The living room is given over to a dining room on one side with a grand piano and music stand designed by the master himself. Seats are built under the window panes which wrap around two sides. Intersecting panes are mitered to do away with even suggestion of a corner, a famous Mr. Wright's technique. The corner glass window was in fact his innovation. And the room is amazing. One could seat even 100 people here and not feel crowded, and yet two people sitting by the fireplace would not feel alone. And then this bird walk which you see, you could come out in the open through a long balcony and be among the birds. This whole place was designed to be appreciated as an art room, but was made to use. In order to really appreciate and understand and to experience it by moving around, sitting by the window, to gather near the fireplace, sit at the dining table, to stroll out to the bird walk. And as I said, this was a balcony which cantilevered out over the hills to thrust 40 feet into the treetops, a feature Mr. Wright introduced so that his wife Ogowana could see the birds at close range. Even from the bird walk, one can see sweeping views of the lake below and the hills. The house, while being very beautiful, was very humble. It was the location for entertaining and for large gathering or meetings. Sunday night dinners were served for the fellowship, and only later, after his death, only cocktails were served in the house at Saturday formals. Following dinner, usually there was a concert. The acoustics were excellent, with a music stand specially designed in the 1930s, providing a well-lit area for 4 musicians to sit around. And a motif was cut into the stand and the chairs abstracted from musical notes. Mr. Wright abstracted nature's essential forms as the basis of his many designs. There is no predictable separation of indoor and outdoor spaces. The rooms which are separate are interlinked diagonally and offer major views from all sides and maximum ventilation in summers. The materials that you see are simple and inexpensive. Plain wood, natural, integral plaster, field stone quarried on the site and placed naturally as walls, no stained glass, sculpture, metal, no false decoration, and yet so magnificent. The house expresses the basic tenet of organic architecture, and Mr. Wright never finished modifying his house, which he regarded as transitory. He often you would say that Taliesin is just a sketch. He would often remark. The charm of Taliesin is not in its individual parts, but in the organic integration of so many parts within a whole. And the daylight filters into the room in many ways, as you can see. There is no picture window scenery like Western architecture. The outdoor scenery is very much part of indoor environment. One could see the scenery changing hour from hour with the changing light. From every room at Taliesin, Mr. Wright could look into the gardens or view the valley. And from his bedroom, he could look through the living room windows into the gardens beyond. Mr. Wright did not limit his concerns for views and cross ventilation to structural orientation and window placement and arrangement. Through judicious juxtaposition of planned outdoor spaces to align with the trees and indoor living spaces, Mr. Wright assured air passing through these spaces would become cooler than ambient temperature before being channeled into living spaces. Mr. Wright also located sizable contained pools of water in exposed locations to utilize prevailing breezes for evaporative cooling. He followed centuries-old method for designing with respect for forces of nature. As you can see in the picture over here, that the view. First, I'd like to show you the view of the garden room, which is an extension of the living room from outside. And then if you see the picture from inside looking out, so you feel so connected with nature. And of course, there was a circle to which he referred as a tea circle with a huge oak tree with a bell hanging. And often during evening tea, the bell would be rung, and the apprentices and staff, wherever they were, would gather here and have tea with Mr. and Mrs. Wright. Mr. Wright was a collector of Oriental art, and the house is filled with screens, prints, and objects from the Orient. And this and the furniture designed by him for this space creates a sense of harmony and feeling of repose so necessary in a house. Every time you enter this wonderful space, you observe something new. His own name was his best, home was his best advertisement. And it has always made an impression on visitors, setting him a man of taste. Even the garden terraces were dotted with large Chinese Buddhist sculptures. And as you can see that at every, for him, terminal points were very important. As you can see some of the pictures which shows how these Chinese and Buddhist sculptures were placed strategically. Mr. Wright changed the furniture placement so many times, as evident in photographs of different times, each time transforming the interior, a continuous experimentation with three-dimensional objects in a space.
In Taliesin East, which was your most favorite building?
This is one of my favorite structures which I saw at Taliesin, Romeo and Juliet. Let me share a story about this structure. It is said that Mr. Wright's aunts asked him to design a new windmill to pump water for their hillside home school which they ran in 1896. And that was the time when Mr. Wright had just begun his architecture journey. In an era where most windmills were iron-framed tripods, Mr. Wright created a soaring post-synthesis of engineering principles and architectural form. In effect, he gave a richly poetic, symbolically potent interpretation to what was the most practical sense a wind-driven water pump. Constructed in the fall of 1897, it is now the earliest surviving project of Frank Lloyd Wright at Taliesin. And Mr. Wright gave this windmill a poetic name, suggesting lovers in a passionate embrace. Clad in cedar shingles, the windmill consisted of a 56 feet high diamond-shaped shaft called Romeo and a shorter octagonal shaft dubbed Juliet. The tower strength came from its construction boards nailed around a central core in a fashion of a barrel, simple but ingenious. Mr. Wright characterized his mid-Western architecture. He singled out the horizontals for a special mention. In fact, the dominant horizontal of the land, vertical elements needed little emphasis.
Please tell us about Taliesin West, which was the winter home for the fellowship.
I would like to talk about Taliesin West and describe, since this is an important part of our discussion today. Way back in 1937, Mr. Wright and his family purchased land in what is now northeast of Scottsdale, Arizona, and began construction on Taliesin West, which became his winter home, studio, and architectural campus, as he was getting work in Phoenix and he wanted to have a desert camp. And from 1938, Mr. Wright divided his life between Taliesin in Wisconsin and Taliesin West in Arizona, making the journey twice each year by automobile back and forth across the American landscape. And this schedule was driven by seasonal heat and cold, the cycle of spring, planting, and fall harvest. And the reason for doing this, that they wanted to escape from the harsh winters of Wisconsin, so they would move to Arizona, and to escape from the harsh summers of Arizona, they would move back to Wisconsin. So that is the reason why they had two camps. And so Mr. Wright returned to both each year full of ideas for change, seizing afresh the task of reshaping buildings and gardens. And it was a pandemonium for 2 weeks, tearing out walls, rebuilding, as recalled some of these senior apprentices. Taliesin West is an integrated complex of buildings, as you see in the plan. Courtyards and gardens aligned, notched and knit into this landscape. Walls, roofs, pergolas and paths catch sunlight and cast shadows. Sightlines point to distant landforms. Walls cut into extend above each out to the immediate terrain. And segments of the main path and most of the buildings that you would see here, there's a studio, the dining room, Kiva, which is the theatre, and Mr. Wright's living quarters, all aligned along a straight line that form the spine of the complex. Mr. Wright considered the orientation of the spine carefully. An early drawing shows a different orientation with the present one, which is shown over here. The spine is aligned so that the walls of the buildings that line at receive both morning sun and afternoon light, and so that ends of the main path point to distant landforms. The spine, moreover, is not an isolated axis but is embedded within two grids, as an orthogonal line in one grid and a diagonal in the other, as you would see in the plan. Buildings, gardens, paths, and patios are set into the slope on some places, elevated on a platform above the desert in others. And if you go straight and you emerge, you keep making turns through different elevated areas, and what made it so interesting. Mr. Wright revered nature, not landscape, and his use of the two words was distinctly different. When Mr. Wright spoke of nature, he spoke of principles, of authority for architectural form, and his words were abstract. He rarely mentioned landscape. When he did describe a landscape, his language focused upon recurrent features or patterns rather than the different variables. He interpreted the prairie as a horizontal plain, emphasizing its flatness, while in fact most prairie landscapes have a rolling topography, and designed most of his prairie-style houses for sites that were originally forested or in the transition zone between forest and prairie. And he used the word nature in several senses as essential quality, material reality, and divine force. He often moved from one sense of the word to another without transition. Let me describe to you one of the most important buildings at Taliesin, which was the Taliesin West Studio. Now, the Taliesin West, as we know, was originally designed and built by Mr. Wright and his apprentices as a winter camp. The architectural studio has become one of the most noteworthy buildings and was the first one to be constructed of native materials, and in many ways it was an experiment, both as a building and as a way of life inspired by Mr. Wright. Accordingly, it was revised and reconsidered over and over again during its early life. Indeed, Taliesin West Studio as it stands today is a drastic change from its original concept as a winter camp workplace. The whole structure seems to grow from the site. Like Taliesin West is made of several structures, all linked together by courtyards, terraces, walkways, and trellised pergolas. And while I spent my time in the studio and I did my analysis of the studio in many ways, since it was the heart of the Taliesin West complex. And the original building, as I was told, in 1938, and most of the revisions were completed by 1961. Walls, as you can see, are slanted slightly inward to mimic the slope of the mountains. Undulating roofline echoes the jagged mountains behind. Mr. Wright experimented with different materials, particularly roof construction, often using new materials. The roof is formed by a network of slanting redwood trusses set on edge above masonry walls. Between each panel were inserted panels of white canvas to serve as a tent-like protection. And there were no glass windows. Instead, canvas flaps open, leaving the structure open to breeze. Glass came much later. His original intention was to use stretched canvas over redwood beams. This resulted in continuous roof modification because of design or the materials involved. The drafting studio is 96 feet long, 30 feet wide, and the space holding drafting tables for 25 apprentices architects. And along the south wall, a long bank of low windows look towards the desert and cities of Scottsdale and Phoenix. On north, a series of tall windows and solid French doors open into the trellis walkway. And then there was a common kitchen and glass enclosed dining room, which is situated on the east of the studio. The early concept of the studio was entirely successful from thermal energy point of view. As in Arizona weather extremes, the original stone, canvas and redwood structures was less than comfortable. The enormous filtration of external air must have created large swings in interior temperature in spite of the mass that was built into the studio. There was also lack of sufficient mechanical system to control interior temperature fluctuation. Mr. Wright's original concept and purpose in creating Taliesin West was to provide a desert environment complex used only during the winters of Arizona. And it's Mr. Wright's growing fondness for the desert kept the fellowship at Taliesin West for a longer period of time. So ultimately he thought of this as a permanent home. And the hardships inherent in this desert experience became part of the Taliesin philosophy. There was minimum of comfort, just enough necessities for survival. And the orientation of the studio is towards the southwest. The view down from the slope of Megdal Peak towards the valley and Phoenix beyond seems to have controlled the placement on the site rather than the consideration of sun angles. In addition, the geometry of the structure is such that it slows little direct exposure of the sun through the operable canvas panels designed for the original building. Mr. Wright was primarily concerned at Taliesin West with intercepting and diffusing the light from the winter sun rather than trapping its energy for its thermal effects. The building was not intended as passive heat gain, but as the moderately effective environmental buffers. And the original building was cooled only to ambient temperature by opening the canvas panels on the south and north walls. And at one time, the operable ceiling panels were also experimented with. There was no ducting system in either the original building or as it stands today. And the contemporary building uses air refrigeration heat pumps units mounted above the walkway on the north side of the building. Due to severe economic consideration, Taliesin West was to characterize building with its frugality, unskilled free labor in form of apprentices allowed the building to be built, and the stone used for the walls was plentiful and free. Cement mortar was mixed by hands using fine sand from the nearby washes. The redwood beams were inexpensive, structural material easily available. Unfortunately, the redwood wood twisted and badly weathered in a few desert summers. They were replaced by steel I-beams. So what you see today are steel I-beams. Mr. Wright would have preferred to use steel in the original concept, but it was financially prohibitive at that point of time. And Mr. Wright replaced the original canvas by glass. And after his death, the complex was completely refitted with the plastic sandwich roof panels which are in use today. And now the drafting studio is used all year. Climate control became an important issue.
What is the Taliesin West garden room about?
Each of the spaces at Taliesin West had its own character and its own architectural form, but all combined together into one integrated space. The garden room was and is the showpiece of Taliesin West, designed, built, remodeled continually by the architect. It evolved into a spacious, well-lighted room from a long, narrow development of the principal structural theme described in the office and the studio. One has to search for the entrance to the garden room from outside. Entrance to this room is through a typically Wrightian low ceiling stone wall space which leads to a room 56 feet long by 34 feet at one place and 24 feet at another. The roof is covered by a sloping translucent roof. The roof opens to a garden on the east side and to the horizon on the south. A large fireplace dominates the far end of the room. At the other end is a 10 feet by 12 feet patio which forms one wall of a well-sheltered alcove which serves as a formal dining area which once served as an intimate private living area for the Wrights. The high side of the garden room was planned to look out to the east, the sun's early morning rays filling the room with sparkling light, the later afternoon hitting the canvas and illuminating the interior with a luscious light. By the time he built Taliesin West, he had conquered the concept of the destruction of the box. In fact, the garden room shows the mastery of the idea, and today the space is used for fellowship meetings and entertaining special guests.
Taliesin must have been a great office. Must have been an eye-opener too. Please tell us about the apprenticeship. We wish to know more about your experience, what kind of people came for the apprenticeship and the fellowship, and what was the training that the fellows underwent.
I have had the distinct pleasure and honor to be part of Taliesin for over 3.5 years as an architect apprentice, and it was the most important experience of my life. Unquestionably, my previous education and experience in India implemented the learning experience, but I must admit I could not distinguish between good and bad architecture then. However, that changed after I joined Frank Lloyd Wright School of Architecture in early 1992. The school, which was begun by Frank Lloyd Wright and his wife Ogawana in 1932 at Taliesin, Wisconsin, an alternative to a strictly academic program of professional training by architects. Taliesin was then dedicated to educating and inculcating young men and women into a life of architecture. Mr. Wright designed a program to provide a total learning environment, synthesizing all aspects of apprentices' lives in order to produce responsible, creative, and cultured human beings. Taliesin still remains the key principles of its founders. The concept of experiential education, learning by doing, was the foundation of the Taliesin apprenticeship program. Apprentices were involved in all aspects of architectural projects that Mr. Wright received, from drawing plans to developing specifications and to provide on-site supervision of actual construction. Although Mr. and Mrs. Wright are no longer alive, their ideas still form the core of the training program. The buildings of Taliesin provide almost unlimited opportunities for apprentices to learn by doing. Frank Lloyd Wright School of Architecture continues to attract significant and growing support from all over the world. And I remember when I was at Taliesin, way back in 1992, there were apprentices from Japan, Germany, China, Switzerland, Sweden, Canada, Paraguay, Scotland, and Greece. And mind you, there were only 35 apprentices at any given time. It went on to have accreditation as an internationally recognized center for design training. The school offered programs leading to 2 degrees, Bachelor of Architectural Studies and the Professional Master of Architecture. The apprentices in either of the 2 programs worked closely with the senior architects on all aspects of projects of the architectural firm, with tasks delegated according to their demonstrated proficiency. The apprentices also got plenty of hands-on opportunity to work with materials and tools on construction projects at Taliesin. Learning at Taliesin is by osmosis. No formal lectures, no confinement within conventional classrooms. The program is designed for individual needs such that apprentices' progress is based on the ability to demonstrate specific skills and abilities in a wide range of ideas and areas. The 2 campuses, Taliesin East in Wisconsin and Taliesin West in Arizona, offered a context for work, study, and exploration that a traditional classroom cannot. In most architectural schools, students are honing their graphic presentation and technical skills and practice architectural problem-solving skills. At Taliesin, apprentices first learn to consider nature as a source of design. The educational program had not altered over the years to conform to an external vision. Instead, the school has successfully allowed outside investigators to understand how the learning by doing program at the school is successful for so many years. Today, the accreditation of the Frank Lloyd Wright School of Architecture has resulted in recognition of the potential for experiential pedagogy to become a national model for architectural education. It has both college accreditation and professional recognition from the National Architectural Accreditation Board. The self-examination by apprentices makes the educational program unique in many ways, enabling the apprentices to participate in the educational model actively and not passively. The Taliesin education over the years has stayed away from conventional classroom exercise. The only time bell rings at Frank Lloyd Wright School of Architecture is at meal times, and they have kept it that way. Taliesin Architects Limited, one of the entities of Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation, recognizes the educational responsibility as a teaching architects towards inculcation of a lifelong learning in the young apprentices who come to the school. Now, this is done through mentorship and daily exposure to real-time case situations, research and development into construction techniques at site and client meetings. The apprentices are part of each project from initial client contact through visioning sessions, program development, design concept, design development, engaging in the project all the way through its completion, interfacing daily with the contractors, consultants, site work until the project is completed. The studio and the school are interlocked components of Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation, and the studio, in its effort to expand on its rich legacy of organic architecture, serves as a living lab for learning by doing pedagogy. My desk, I remember, in the Hillside Studio in Wisconsin was at the far end, one of the 40 drawing boards under a forest of dark oak wood beams looming above my head, allowing natural filtered light pouring in. One of the maxims inscribed on the beams, I still remember, one of Mr. Wright's favorite was, "What a man does, he has." I would read this every day in the studio and ponder on its deep meaning. Construction being a foundation component of the learning experience of architecture, often the young graduates find themselves ill-equipped having graduated from conventional schools of architecture. This lack of exposure to means, methods, and materials is an arena which architects have shied away from in contemporary practice. At Taliesin, it is fully embraced by the apprentices. A hands-on experience allows the young architects to understand the nature of materials and the way in which those materials find an appropriate place in architecture. I have learned how to learn. The pedagogy, learning by doing, the synthesis of ideas, facts, and experience which can be obtained from the study of nature with the guidance of senior members and interaction with fellow international apprentices, along with the contact with the underlying principles of Mr. Wright's organic architecture, cannot be obtained anywhere else in the world today. The senior members served as instructors in the basics of architecture, utilizing the on-campus projects as living case studies. As mentors, they weave the greater cultural fabric of Taliesin into the life and creative endeavors of the apprentice. For 6 months of each year, May to October, the school would operate from Taliesin, Wisconsin, and for winter months, November to May, the school moved back to a desert camp, Taliesin West, Arizona, which is 26 miles northeast of Phoenix. The way of life at Taliesin was intended to be a spontaneous experience. All apprentices were expected to fulfill the task assigned to them in the studios, kitchen, construction, and maintenance. The apprentice-mentor ratio was 1:1, which explained the importance of the apprentice-student non-existent elsewhere. I found that spirit counts the most at Taliesin, with self-reliance and a spirit of cooperation as important tools for community living. It's a place where architecture is pursued as a way of life and learning through active participation in the performing arts, music, dance, drama. It's a place to embrace community life, whether it is gardening, maintenance, cooking, or joining fellowship activities, which culminates in architectural exploration and an artistic endeavor. Mr. Wright once said that every task is an opportunity for creative work. Since the concept of a Taliesin trained architect is very different from that of other colleges, a student here is referred as an apprentice and not as a student. The community life at Taliesin is very special. Members of the fellowship comprising apprentices who come to the school along with the senior apprentices who train directly under Mr. Wright live on campus. Some members who live off campus also embrace its community life. As a new apprentice, it was first difficult to understand why I had to work in the kitchen as a helper or in the garden. I asked myself, what do these things have to do with designing of buildings? When I was finally assigned to work on the drawings for buildings, I brought with me not only the work experience of a kitchen, farm and garden, but also that of having worked at Taliesin as a carpenter, mason, roofer, and I soon realized that the first-hand experience of having worked on the construction of buildings gave me a clearer understanding of what I was putting down on paper. Work also became an adventure, and I soon started to take pride in whatever work I accomplished. And during my stay at Taliesin, I examined different aspects: architecture, culture, philosophy, creative insights of Mr. Wright's working method, and attempted to present a thorough analysis of his thoughts about different aspects of architecture and life. I had the good fortune of studying in the Frank Lloyd Wright archives, which is located at Taliesin West, the transcripts of his talks given to apprentices at the Sunday breakfast table in his lifetime, and then selecting an appropriate one and organizing a discussion at the Sunday breakfast table for the fellowship. Now, this is something which I'll play in a small audio clipping towards the end of our program. The fellowship comprised a group of 24 apprentices, a few guests, and of course the senior fellowship members who were the original apprentices to Mr. Wright, working on the restoration of his buildings at Taliesin, research of his drawings in the archives, and undertaking the selection of Mr. Wright's audio talks was an eye-opener. These audio recordings of talks were made by Bruce Pfeiffer in the 1950s when Mr. Wright addressed the fellowship during his Sunday talks. And years later, after listening to the talks or reading the transcripts, I realized how much closer I've come to the ideas and statements with a clear focus and a deeper understanding of his philosophy. And it was a wonderful learning experience listening to the audio tapes of the world's most articulate architectural genius. The best way to appreciate good architecture is to experience it. Walk around the buildings, go inside, spend time sitting, experience the spaces, the scale, proportion, and the finer details. This was done extensively at both the Taliesin buildings in Arizona and in Wisconsin, and also his private works. I never felt the same after visiting his buildings. After walking into the central space of the Guggenheim Museum in New York, the workroom of the Johnson Administration Building, the living room of Taliesin or Fallingwater, one felt as if an invisible force had shaken you, opening you to a new truth of spatial experience never been witnessed in any other building. And my whole understanding of architecture of Mr. Wright changed forever. To my mind, both the Taliesins, East and West, have a special place in architectural history, simply because they were not only great designs, but also because they were both apprentice-built and apprentice-maintained. Even now, after so many years of Mr. Wright's death, these important landmarks continue to teach apprentices the true architecture. I believe there's so much to learn and emulate from the Taliesin experience. And Taliesin was an attempt to grasp the ideal, learning by doing, of into cooperation in solving common problems, working together in the studio and the kitchen, working at construction sites, meeting the clients, working on Saturday mornings in the garden, and entertaining guests in tuxedos in the evening, all of which makes the life of the apprentices so full and fascinating here. My 3.5 years at Taliesin immersed me in a totally creative environment where everyone contributed in many ways, be it music, gardening, studio, theatre, cooking, and group learning opportunities. It was the Taliesin ideal of a well-balanced life in a beautiful environment with extraordinary buildings. What more could you ask for? I had a great time at Taliesin, and I'm grateful to God that I spent those unforgettable years of my life over there. Now, everybody at Taliesin was so committed. The vitality, the daily challenges, and the dynamic environment is such that all the visiting scholars and critics I came across, they said that they had not come across any other community as vibrant as this one. And going back to a statement which Mr. Architect John Rattenbury, whom I mentioned earlier, was a senior architect at Taliesin Architects, described the daily life over there. You learn the best way to relax is not to lie around, but to find another project. It is very stimulating to be engaged in a variety of activities that require different type of skills. It provides many type of outlets for your energies. And Mr. Wright challenged young architects to move to a higher lane of architecture. He would say that the architect must be the master in the interior sense, not only of his materials, but also of the human spirit. The soul of humanity is in his charge, really. And he was an epic figure, head and shoulders above any other talented architect of his era, even before and after. He was gifted with extraordinary four-dimensional imagination. He broke the mold of the 19th century eclecticism, creating a new architecture for the 20th century. Mr. Wright's originality and his view of his design as an organic whole, a total functioning unit related to nature, broke the mold of the traditional Victorian style. His work, the thing that is entrusted to him by way of his virtue, is the broadest of all. His education passed on to the young apprentices through his school at Taliesin, his publications, and his architectural work, which are very important contributions to the profession.
Please tell us more about the apprentice shelters.
It's interesting that you've asked me about this apprentice shelters, and I'm sure many people would be curious to know what kind of shelters were these and why would the apprentices live in such shelters. Let me tell you, Frank Lloyd Wright always maintained that nature was the best teacher for an architect. The cycles of nature and weather, the sun, the wind, water, makes you more aware of what the essence of shelter is, something that every architect has to deal with. And if you can design and build a shelter that you can live in, you're on your way to become an architect. And the first year apprentices generally live in the simple 8 by 8 feet square shepherd tents with a base. And the picture that you see is a shelter which I put up for myself when I joined. So, on the third day of my joining Taliesin West, that's where I arrived first, I was asked to pick up any spot in the desert and make a shelter for myself. And I wandered around looking at, a spot where I could have a shelter for myself. So I picked up an abandoned concrete base, which had a native stone. And then I put up a 8 feet by 8 feet square pyramid shelter, and which was it had canvas roof. So when my friends at Arizona State University complained about the size of their dormitory rooms, I would tell them about my 64 square feet space. Yet few people are able to live so close to nature. For me, it was a priceless experience. The only light source in the desert shelters is candlelight or kerosene lamp. In the evening or early winter mornings, the glow from city lights or flashlights provides illumination for apprentices to walk from the desert shelters to the main buildings of Taliesin West, where showers and locker rooms are provided. Apprentices sleep, study, and spend much of their weekends in the shelters. And meals were prepared and served in the kitchen and dining area of Taliesin West. It is not that all throughout your stay at Taliesin you would have to live in those shelters, but it was expected that when a new apprentice would join, for at least a couple of months, one had to experience this. And after a year or two, In a shepherd's tent, apprentices would often choose to design more elaborate shelters or enlarge existing ones. Each one was customized according to the apprentice's personal interest and talents. Some apprentices added solar panels much later or fireplaces. Others added glass or patios, often completely reworking the design. And the shelters became a living laboratory for architectural discovery. You become your own architect, your own builder, and your own client. What a fascinating experience that was. And often apprentices would also inherit desert shelters that had been vacated by others. And it was a different experience being so close to the environment. And I remember in the early mornings when the kitchen bell would ring, and that would be like a wake-up call for the apprentices to get out of the shelter, go to their locker rooms, which were not very far, and change and then get ready to go to the dining area for their morning breakfast. And this is typically what the life would be, that you would work in different areas, whether you were working in the outside areas or you were working in the studio, and have your meals and have get together, and only at night you carry your flashlight back to your shelter. And as you would roam around, you would see many other shelters all scattered around. And I remember there was a Japanese apprentice who had made a very elaborate shelter, and it was more like a home for him. So it was really fascinating for each apprentice to be given an opportunity to make a shelter for themselves.
This was wonderful, amazing experience for all the apprentices, living in shelters, working hands-on in the kitchen, in the farm. It must have been immense. I have a question which has been raised. You had written about Frank Lloyd Wright and Mahatma Gandhi when you had returned. There was an article. Could you elaborate as to how you made that parallel and what thought brought it together?
It's interesting that you've asked me to talk about Frank Lloyd Wright and Mahatma Gandhi. Yes, I remember I had written an article sometime back in A+D about where I drew comparison and similarities between the two great personalities. To me, Frank Lloyd Wright and Mahatma Gandhi were quintessential thinkers, sharing similar views. Born in the same era, both believed in simplicity of thought and truth, and each strived to achieve dignity for the individual while strongly believing in freedom and democracy. While Mahatma Gandhi fought the British rule to give India its true democracy, Frank Lloyd Wright, towards the second half of his career, fully developed the concept of buildings for democracy. Mr. Wright did not consider democracy to be a form of government so much as a way of living. Both knew that idea is the most important thing on earth, and both caused a revolution in their respective worlds with their ideas. Both needed an audience, both found it. Millions followed what they had to offer. Both came in at a time when there was a sense of cultural identity crisis, and both saw something under the sun for their countries. They were visionaries, ahead of their time, and were able to inspire, then and now, millions of people in the world. While Mahatma Gandhi was able to liberate Indians from colonial rule, Mr. Wright liberated people from the prison of the box, a closed compartmentalized system of architecture, and transformed them into a new sense of freedom and space. Both favored organic use of materials and proved themselves by their actions. The phrase "think globally, act locally" was followed in substance by both. While Gandhiji initiated the Salt March from Ahmedabad to Dandi, which was attended by local people but had support from the people who never produced salt, the idea captured everyone's imagination and assumed huge proportions. When Mr. Wright designed Unity Temple, he reacted to Chicago's conditions and budget of the organizers but his solution of breaking the box had global influence. Nothing was fake about the two. Both brought to the people a whole new world of truth and beauty. They were concerned with moral and social values and had environmental concerns. Their ideas were timeless and they thought about not just for their countries but for humanity as a whole. They were giants without equal. To adequately study the life and works of Mr. Wright and Gandhiji requires as it merits the work of a lifetime. Yet anyone can benefit from even a fragmentary acquaintance of their experience and thought. Both wrote extensively and with great clarity about their principles, objectives, and experience. They were not easily satisfied. When Mr. Wright was asked which was the best building, he said the next one. Gandhiji advised that true satisfaction lies in the effort rather than in the attainment. Both put less stock in formal education than in learning from experience. Both thought outside the box, dared to ask questions, few even thinking of asking. Their spouses too believed in and carried out their ideas with great fervor, and they never shied from expressing themselves forcefully and with conviction. Mahatma Gandhi's wife was once asked by a journalist how he could accomplish so much. Simple, she said. Gandhiji is congruent with regard to speech, thought, and action. The same can be said for that of Mr. Wright. The level of congruency in an architect's character is the measurement of the quality of service he may provide to his fellow man. If attempting to create an environment which fosters cultural energy, the architect has a better chance for success when he knows his core self has mission, his limits and capabilities with minimum amount of self-deception. Both were leaders to the end, inspiring generations of people and transforming their thoughts and ideas. And Mr. Wright's method of teaching finds a chord of similarity in Rabindranath Tagore at Shantiniketan, I believe. While Mr. Wright founded the fellowship in 1932, Tagore founded Shantiniketan in 1918. Both had enormous talent. Taliesin is much like Gurukul or ashrams. It is ironical that with the traditional Guru Shishya education methodology followed through ages, our architecture profession has not adopted this. Our Shilpa Kala may have benefited for the baton passed from one generation to another, but architectural fraternity sadly lacked the vision. We got to see this aspect in another aspect of the world with the formation of the Taliesin Fellowship by the Wright to ensure that our organic architecture endures with its deep-rooted philosophy, universally applicable then and now.
At the end of this experience on Taliesin and the apprenticeship and the fellowship of Taliesin, Professor Vivek Sabherwal would share a brief note, a brief lecture on desert architecture in the voice of FLW himself.
This morning, I think we ought to talk about our practical affairs here. And we are in the desert again, where everything is ready to fight everything else. Have you ever noticed, if you studied the cactus growth around here, how everything is armed, not only to the teeth, but everywhere else. It's perfectly amazing the economy, too, with which these things are built. If you want to study economy of construction, take a branch of, well, the Sawara is the limit, of course, and then you have the choya. You boys ever examined a choya stalk? You'll see them lying around here, all dried up. Nothing but the bones left. Have you ever studied the bones of the choya and see how material is economized? Now, in the East, that would grow solid. Around us in Wisconsin, where things are all fat and easy, you'd have a solid stalk with flesh. But up here, you have this good pattern for reinforcing by steel. Here you have the strand. Here you have all the scientific properties of steel construction evident in these things in the desert, where economy was imperative. And this Sabherwal is a skyscraper standing up with just a little clutch at the bottom, stands there all these years. Have you ever seen one stripped? In each flute there is a rib, and that rib is almost equal to steel, and it's all in tension and all fastened down to a little root, and the root system is such that it's a marvel that it stands there tall, but it does, chiefly on account of its weight. Great weight on a single point, you see. Then it has a little trunk, root that goes like an elephant's trunk in search of water. And it'll catch a little pool over here probably when it rains. The water will congregate there. Now it couldn't live on the water that it could get where it stands, so it goes out after water. And you'll see all those simple natural things that really our architecture and our engineering and everything else is based upon. Insofar as it's all natural like that, why, it's good. Then it all gets confused and you get all sorts of reactionary, interactionary effects that work upon it that don't matter. So long as you stick to those elementary principles in architecture, it's all you need. No one needs to know how heavy you have to have or knows the reactions in a beam, whether it shall be 6-inch, 8-inch channel or a beam section or that sort of thing. That's the book's knowledge that comes by being an engineer directly and professionally. But an architect doesn't need that. He has the engineer the way the engineer has the book, and he uses it in that way. But he must know these elementary principles and reactions of nature. And here you have a great chance to study them firsthand. I know I've been continually amazed discovering new things as I walk around. You should take your walks daily and go through and don't miss anything. Look at these little things around your feet. And you can see, of course, if you want, if you're interested geologically, you can see here the youngest country in this country, probably any other country. Arizona is very young. If you go further west, you'll see it gradually becoming smoother, more undulating, more quiet. But here it's tempestuous and freshly made. The cataclysm wasn't so far away here. And of course, all that you see in the way of nature here is cataclysmic. It's the result of great explosive forces fighting each other. And what you see is a form of debris. But in that debris, and the way it is left there, and the way it's piled up, you can study all these things that constitute the nature of materials. You'll see them all there, and you'll also see the way nature has handled them. And from that, you also learn lessons. And what you should first get into your systems when you get here into the desert is to get that lesson from nature in architecture, which is fundamental to the whole thing we call architecture. And here you have it stripped. In the East, it's not so easy to come by. There is a great efflorescence. The difference between this bougainvillea and that cactus out there would be the difference between the two places. So inhabiting the two places, you learn. You have the open book of nature. On the one page, you have efflorescence, richness, ease, what comes of great, well, I suppose actually it's a form of decay. Perhaps this vegetation that grows all over so abundantly is a form of mold that comes upon the more accurate elements, the stone foundation of things. And when you get out here, you're back to the foundation, and there you are to the process that goes somewhere. No one has ever found out, or even prophesied, I think, yet, whether the whole thing is degenerate or whether it is regenerate. We'd have to read that answer in the stars, wouldn't we? That's a species of cosmography. It concerns the architect, too. But to me, an architect is a man who knows, first by nature, knows the secrets of nature, and studies them and is informed by them, and comes out strong with knowledge. He has a feeling first. At first he is an introvert, and he gathers all this in. And then afterward, by sheer dint of his force of character and his love of creation, if he's a creative individual, it all comes out his way. But now don't get wrong this idea of individuality. You can see individuality in all these things, can't you? There's but one principle back of that thing we call a flower. There's only one principle back of this whole series, whole world of cacti. Only one principle. And it's a principle that you should study. It's these great elemental basic things in nature that give the architect his certainty and his strength. Now he, of course, is like one of these things. He'll become a species, he'll become a feature of the flora, fauna maybe, or whatever it is. That's open to him as an architect, as a designer, as a maker of form, and he will understand his way, the thing that he has seen.